At 78 years old, Eleanor Brennan believed that the least life owed her was the dignity of growing old surrounded by the people she had poured everything into raising. She had not asked for wealth or recognition, or even gratitude, though gratitude would have been nice. She had asked only for the quiet assurance that when the ground shifted beneath her feet, as it inevitably does beneath everyone's feet, if they live long enough, there would be hands reaching down to steady her. Instead, she stood on the cracked sidewalk of Laurel Lane at 6:40 in the morning on the 4th of March, a single suitcase at her side, watching two men in gray uniforms load the sum total of 19 years onto a donation truck as if they were clearing debris after a storm no one particularly cared to remember. The house behind her was a modest single-story rental with faded blue shutters and a porch that leaned slightly to the left where the support column had never been properly repaired. She had painted those shutters twice by hand, mixed the color herself from leftover cans she found at the hardware store's clearance bin, because she believed a home deserved care, whether or not you held the deed. She had tended the small yard through every season, coaxed roses from soil that wanted to grow nothing but crabgrass, swept the porch every morning before the sun cleared the tree line. None of that mattered now. The house belonged to Craig Landry of Atlanta, Georgia, a man she had never met, and Craig Landry of Atlanta, Georgia had decided it was worth more sold than occupied by an elderly woman whose right to be there had died with his father 4 months earlier. The March wind cut through her cardigan with the indifference of weather that does not know or care what it interrupts. Eleanor pulled the fabric tighter across her chest and watched the men carry out the sewing basket she had owned for 31 years. The one Walter had bought her at a flea market in Grover's Mill, the autumn before they married. The wicker darkened by decades of handling the lining she had replaced 4 times, because the basket itself was irreplaceable. They set it on the truck bed next to a box of photo albums. Next to that, wrapped in a pillowcase, she recognized as one of her own, was Walter's Bible, the one with his handwriting filling every margin in pencil, so faint you had to hold it at an angle to read notes he had written during sermons and late nights. And the quiet hours of a life lived without spectacle, but with extraordinary attention. Her children stood in a loose semicircle near the curb, and not one of them was crying. Martin, her eldest at 54, occupied the space closest to the truck, with the practiced stance of a man who had somewhere more important to be, and was already calculating how many minutes this would take. He wore a charcoal suit and shoes buffed to a shine that caught the weak morning light, and he had not looked up from his phone since Eleanor came outside. His thumb moved across the screen with the steady rhythm of someone conducting business or pretending to, or simply finding the screen more comfortable than his mother's face. When the man paused to adjust a box that wouldn't fit, Martin glanced up just long enough to offer logistical input, his voice carrying the same flat managerial cadence he used for conference calls. "Mom, you need to step back from the steps. The new tenants are doing a walkthrough this afternoon. It'll be awkward if you're still standing here." Awkward. Eleanor turned the word over slowly in her mind, examining it the way you might examine a stone pulled from a riverbed, curious what lived underneath. Not heartbreaking, not unjust, not even unfortunate. Awkward. As if her presence on the sidewalk of the home she had lived in for nearly 2 decades was a scheduling conflict, a minor inconvenience in someone else's afternoon. Judith, 51, stood slightly apart with a clipboard pressed against her hip and a pen tucked behind her ear. She had driven up from her downtown apartment at dawn, not to comfort her mother, but to coordinate, and the distinction between those two actions was so vast it could swallow a person whole. She moved through the morning with the focused efficiency of a project manager overseeing a demolition, rather than a daughter helping her mother through the worst morning of her life. She checked items off a list Eleanor had not been consulted on. She spoke to the donation truck driver about pickup receipts and tax deductions. She explained when Eleanor asked one more time if she might stay with her temporarily, that her apartment simply was not set up for a long-term guest, that her travel schedule made it impractical, that the timing was just not right. And she delivered this explanation with the polished regret of someone who had rehearsed it in the mirror, until the edges of guilt had been sanded smooth enough to swallow. Dean, the youngest, at 48, leaned against the hood of his SUV with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the proceedings with the detached amusement of a spectator at a moderately entertaining event. He had recently moved his family into a new house on the north side of town. 4 bedrooms, a yard. His children could grow into a house Eleanor had never lived in and never would. When she had called him 2 weeks ago, her voice careful and steady, because she had already cried in private and would not give anyone the satisfaction of hearing it, he had listened to her explain the situation and then told her the timing just wasn't good for them. That between the move and the kids' school schedules and his wife's new work hours, taking on a house guest would create more stress than anyone needed. He had used the word house guest to describe his mother. Now he stood against his car and watched the last of her belongings disappear into the truck. And when Eleanor caught his eye, he smiled. Not a cruel smile, not deliberate malice, but something worse, the absent half grin of a man who had already categorized this moment as something that would resolve itself and therefore did not require his emotional investment. The story of how Eleanor Brennan arrived at this sidewalk was not complicated. Mr. Landry, the owner of the Laurel Lane house, had been a kind man in the specific old-fashioned way that certain men in small Tennessee towns are kind, with handshakes that meant contracts and promises that held weight because the man behind them held weight. After Walter's death 11 years ago, Landry had come to Eleanor's door with a casserole his late wife had taught him to make and an offer that had no paperwork behind it. Stay as long as you need, he had told her. Pay what you can when you can. This house needs someone in it who cares about it, and you care about things, Eleanor. That's plain enough to see. She had stayed. Paid rent when she could, sometimes short, sometimes late, always eventually. Landry never pressed, never threatened, never so much as raised an eyebrow when the check arrived on the 15th instead of the 1st. He understood in the way that people of his generation sometimes understood without being told that a widow on a seamstress's income was doing her best, and her best was enough. Landry died in November at 89, peacefully in his sleep in the house 3 streets over that he had lived in for 62 years. His son Craig flew in from Atlanta for the funeral, stayed 4 days, met with a realtor on day 2 and listed both properties before his father's obituary finished running in the Sutter Falls Gazette. Craig had never met Eleanor. He had never visited his father's rental properties. He saw a line item on an inheritance spreadsheet and did what people do with line items, converted it to liquid value as efficiently as possible. There was no lease, no written agreement. The promise of a good man held no legal weight once the good man was in the ground. And Eleanor had known this was coming since the day she stood at Landry's graveside and watched Craig check his watch during the pastor's closing prayer. She had spent the week since then calling her children. Individually first, then together, on a 3-way call that lasted 11 minutes and ended with Martin suggesting for the 3rd time that a managed care facility was the most practical solution for everyone involved. Eleanor had tried to explain with the patience of a woman accustomed to threading needles in dim light that the waiting list for affordable senior housing in Sutter Falls stretched 9 months to over a year. That 19 years of seamstress income and Walter's medical bills had left her with almost nothing in savings. That she was asking for a room, a couch, a temporary space to breathe while she figured out the next step. She was not asking for forever. She was asking for a bridge. Martin had countered with brochures. Judith had countered with her schedule. Dean had countered with silence, which was its own kind of answer. And now here she was, on the sidewalk, one suitcase. 6:40 in the morning in early March in Sutter Falls, Tennessee, the town where she had lived her entire adult life, raised 3 children, buried a husband, sewn wedding dresses and baptismal gowns and prom alterations for half the county. And apparently none of that amounted to enough credit with the universe or her own family to secure a warm place to sleep. Eleanor watched the truck driver close the rear gate. He latched it with a metallic clang that sounded to her ears like the period at the end of a very long sentence. She turned to her children. All three looked up at roughly the same time, as if synchronized by the shared awareness that the logistics portion of the morning was concluding, and the emotional portion might now require their brief attention. I have somewhere to go. The words formed in her mouth before she had fully decided to say them, rising from a place deeper than deliberation, from the bedrock of a woman who had spent 78 years solving problems because no one else was going to solve them for her. All three of her children looked at her simultaneously. Martin from his phone, Judith from her clipboard, Dean from his practiced lean against the car, and all three wore the same expression of skepticism poorly disguised as concern. Mama Iris's land on Briarwood Road. The main house burned, but the land is still in the family name. There's the outbuilding in the back with the loft she built herself. It's still standing. I'll stay there while I sort out the next step. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds before Judith laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the uncomfortable exhale of someone unsure how to respond. A real laugh, sharp and dismissive, rising from genuine disbelief that someone could be so foolish. Dean picked it up immediately the way he had always picked up his sister's cues, and even Martin allowed himself a slow headshake, accompanied by a smile that managed to be both pitying and impatient. Dean pushed off the car and uncrossed his arms, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone addressing a person who has clearly lost all connection to reality. Mom, that place hasn't been touched in 20 years. No electricity, no running water. You're talking about living in a rotting loft from before your grandkids were born. That's not a plan. That is where I will be. Eleanor cut him off, and something in her voice made all three of them go still in a way they had not been still all morning. It was not volume. It was not anger. It was the absolute absence of negotiation, the sound of a door closing from the inside. If any of you ever decide to actually care what happens to me, you'll know where to find me. Though I won't hold my breath waiting for that particular miracle. She picked up the suitcase, the single bag her children had agreed to let her keep from an entire household of belongings, and began walking down Laurel Lane. She did not look back. She had spent too many years of her life looking back at people who were not looking at her, and she was finished with that arithmetic. Behind her, Martin's voice drifted through the cold morning air, low and unhurried, the voice of a man confident in his prediction. Give her a few days. When she realizes she can't survive out there alone, she'll come back and accept the assisted living idea. Let her go. Let her go. As if she were a bird released from a hand that had never held her particularly tightly to begin with. In her coat pocket pressed against the worn lining where the stitching had loosened. Years ago, Eleanor felt the small iron key on its tarnished chain. Her mother had placed it in her hand on the last day of her life in the narrow hospital bed at Sutter Falls General, the room smelling of antiseptic and cut flowers, and the stillness that fills a room when the body in the bed has already begun its departure. Iris Mosley's fingers had been thin and cool, her grip surprisingly firm, for a woman whose lungs were filling with fluid, and she had pulled Eleanor close enough that her whisper landed warm against Eleanor's ear. When everything is gone and you have no one left, go to the loft. I left something there for you, something that will matter when nothing else does anymore. Promise me you'll remember. Eleanor had promised, believing at the time that it was the confused urgency that fading minds sometimes press onto ordinary objects, the kind of insistence that means everything to the speaker and puzzles the listener until both are gone and the question no longer matters. She had tucked the key into her pocket and held her mother's hand until the monitors went flat. And in the 30 years since she had kept the key close without ever using it, the way you keep a photograph of someone you loved without ever being able to look at it for too long. 30 years of carrying it. 30 years of knowing it opened something her mother had considered important enough to mention with her last conscious breaths. And 30 years of choosing not to think about it too carefully. Because thinking too carefully about the things Iris Mosley left behind meant thinking about everything else that had been taken. And Eleanor had survived the decades since 1988 by building walls around certain rooms in her memory and keeping those doors shut with the quiet discipline of a woman who understood that some pain examined too closely becomes uninhabitable. But now the other doors were shut too, the real ones. Laurel Lane was gone. Her children had made their positions clear with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. And the key in her pocket felt heavier than it had in years, as if the metal itself understood that the conditions Iris had described, everything gone, no one left, had finally, precisely, irrevocably arrived. Eleanor Brennan had grown up poor in the East End of Sutter Falls, the eldest of 4 children in a narrow, clapboard house where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's television, and the roof leaked in 3 places that her mother marked with coffee cans every rainy season. Her father left before she was old enough to carry reliable memories of his face, leaving behind a closet of work shirts that smelled like motor oil, and a silence her mother filled with work. Iris mostly took double shifts at the textile mill, standing 8 hours at a loom and then 8 more at a different station, coming home with her hands cramped and her ankles swollen, and somehow still finding the energy to check homework. Braid hair settled disputes and maintained the unshakable fiction that everything was fine and they had enough. And wanting more was just greedy when you already had each other. Eleanor inherited that quality, completely took it into her adult life like a torch she never considered setting down. The ability to make do, the refusal to let circumstance become identity, the bone-deep understanding that dignity is not something the world gives you, but something you build every morning out of whatever raw materials are available, even when the materials are terrible and the blueprints are lost and everyone around you has decided you are not worth the effort. She married Walter Brennan at 26. He was an electrician from Grover's Mill, the next town over. A quiet man with strong hands and a talent for fixing broken things, and a greater talent, one that could not be taught or bought, for making Eleanor feel like the most important person in whatever room they shared. They were never wealthy, never owned property, never accumulated the financial cushion that might have protected her later. What they had instead was a life built entirely on presence, on showing up and staying and choosing each other, and choosing their children every day without exception, without complaint, with the steady, unremarkable devotion that does not make for dramatic stories but makes for a life worth having lived. Eleanor sewed for a living, had done so her entire adult life, taking alterations and custom orders from a small workroom she set up in whatever house they were renting at the time. The income was modest and irregular, dependent on seasons and weddings, and the variable willingness of Sutter Falls residents to pay a fair price for skilled handwork in an era of factory clothing. But she was genuinely good at it, possessed the rare combination of technical precision and aesthetic instinct that separates competent seamstresses from artists, and she carried a quiet, unannounced pride in that skill. She sewed baptismal gowns and prom dresses and bridesmaids' alterations. She rescued wedding dresses the week before the ceremony, when panicked brides discovered burst seams. She repaired suits for funerals and let out waistbands for men who would not admit they had gained weight, and hemmed curtains for women who wanted their windows to look right. Half of Sutter Falls had worn her work at some point, and most of them had forgotten her name. Walter traveled for work, frequently electrical contracts across the county, and sometimes farther, and Eleanor managed everything in his absence. School schedules, childhood illnesses, teenage crises, homework battles, the constant low-grade logistics of raising 3 children on an unpredictable income. She did this with the understated competence of a woman who simply did what needed doing, because someone had to do it and no one else was volunteering. Walter died 11 years ago, a Tuesday morning in early October, 2013. No warning, no time for goodbye. Myocardial infarction at 68 years old, arriving without announcement and leaving without apology. Eleanor was 67. The ground collapsed beneath her life without drama, without ceremony. Exactly the way the most devastating things tend to happen quietly and completely between one breath and the next. She survived. Perhaps that was the most honest thing that could be said about the years that followed, that she had survived them quietly and without much help from anyone. Her children appeared in the raw early days of grief, the way people appear at funerals and in the rough first weeks after, with casseroles and concerned faces and the temporary urgency of obligation. But sympathy has an expiration date, and when it passed, Martin and Judith and Dean retreated to their full and busy lives, with the unconscious relief of people who had fulfilled their duty and could now return to the comfortable business of being alive without the inconvenient reminder of someone who was struggling with it. Eleanor did not resent them. Or she told herself she did not, which amounts to the same thing when you are 67 and alone, and the distinction between acceptance and self-preservation is too fine to pass. She continued, sewed, paid rent, maintained a small life with modest materials, and expected nothing from anyone because expecting nothing is the only reliable way to avoid being disappointed by the people you love. She did not cry walking down Laurel Lane with her suitcase pulling unevenly on the cracked pavement. She had spent too many years of her life crying for things that did not change, and the tears had accomplished nothing, except making her feel foolish afterwards sitting alone in a dark room with a wet face and the same problems she had started with. What she felt now was colder than grief and more purposeful than sadness. A quiet, steady determination that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sinking past the layers of hurt and humiliation to rest somewhere deep and immovable. It was not that losing the house did not hurt, it did. But it was a practical problem, the kind with potential practical solutions, and Eleanor had solved practical problems her entire life. What broke something deeper and more essential inside her was the way her children had handled it. The complete absence of anguish in their voices. Martin scrolling through his phone all morning, as if his mother's eviction were happening on a screen he could minimize. Judith with her clipboard organizing the dismantlement of Eleanor's life with the same detached professionalism she brought to quarterly reports. Dean's smile. And they had not kept her things, had not pulled a single item from the truck and said, let me hold on to this for you, at least this. The photo albums, Walter's Bible, the fabric samples she had collected over 30 years because she loved beautiful things, and beautiful things deserve to be preserved, even when they were small, even when no one else saw them. There was one detail that cut sharper than all the rest, a specific wound she kept returning to, the way your tongue finds a broken tooth. Somewhere in those boxes now rattling toward a donation warehouse was a small wooden box, and inside that box was the last Valentine's card Walter had written her 3 months before he died. Nothing elaborate. Walter was not an elaborate man, just a drugstore card with a sunset on the cover, and his handwriting inside the careful, blocky letters of a man who wrote slowly because he wanted every word to be right. She had read that card every night for the first year of widowhood, holding it in the lamplight of the bedroom they had shared, tracing the letters with her fingertip, keeping the shape of his thoughts alive through the repetition of touch. And now it was gone, traveling toward a warehouse shelf where it would mean nothing to anyone, just another piece of paper in a dead man's Bible. She had not been fast enough to save it. The men in gray had been efficient, and her children had been impatient, and the truck had swallowed everything before she could think clearly enough to say, wait, not that one, please, not that. A tan sedan had been parked near the junction of Laurel Lane and the county road when Eleanor left that morning. Behind the wheel, Clara Jessup drank gas station coffee and watched the old woman drag a suitcase down the sidewalk alone. Clara was 35 3 years into her beat at the county paper, and she had come to Laurel Lane to follow up on the eviction item she had filed on page 9 the previous week. A thin human interest piece about a widow losing her rental. She had expected to find a moving truck and maybe a neighbor willing to give a quote. Instead, she found Eleanor Brennan walking east toward Briarwood Road in a cardigan that was not warm enough for March, alone with no car and no companion, and no one watching her go except a reporter who almost did not come because page 9 stories rarely go anywhere. Clara wrote the license plate of Martin's sedan in her notebook, then the time, then a single sentence she underlined twice. 3 adult children present. None offered a ride. She started her engine but did not follow, not yet. Something about the way Eleanor moved unhurried, and AIM told Clara this story was not finished, and the part that mattered had not happened yet. 4 miles from the center of town to Briarwood Road. The sidewalk gave way to gravel after the first half mile, and the gravel gave way to packed dirt after the first mile, the road narrowing between rows of hickory trees whose roots buckled the surface into ridges and dips that made pulling a suitcase an act of constant negotiation. Eleanor moved slowly, adjusting her grip on the handle, stepping around the worst of the ruts, keeping her breathing steady through the protest of a lower back that had been filing complaints for the better part of a decade. She did not allow herself to think too carefully about what she was walking toward. Thinking too carefully had a way of making things impossible before you arrived to assess them honestly. And she had lived long enough to know that most situations were considerably more manageable in reality than in anticipation. She focused on the physical act of moving. Each step, each breath, the weight of the suitcase, the cold against her face, the steady metronome of her own footsteps on packed earth-proof, that she was still here, still moving, still capable of choosing a direction and walking in it. The landscape thinned and quieted around her. She passed the Granger mailbox rusted completely through and swallowed by trumpet vine until only the post was visible, a metal skeleton dressed in green. She passed the leaning fence at the County Road junction, the posts rotted to softness and tipping into the soil at exhausted angles. She crossed the dry creek bed she remembered from childhood, when spring melt turned it into a rushing channel. Cold enough to numb your feet and fast enough to carry sticks downstream like tiny boats. And she and her brothers would race them screaming with a joy that belonged to children who had not yet learned what the world intended to do with that joy. The creek was silent now, the banks covered in faded winter grass holding the shape of water without any of its life. The Moseley property announced itself gradually. The trees thinned where the yard had once been cleared. The gravel drive faded to a suggestion, and then the concrete foundation appeared, the footprint of the house where Iris Moseley had lived for 40 years before a gas leak and a spark had taken it in a single night 12 years ago. Weeds and saplings had colonized every crack in the slab. Wild roses sprawled across the southern edge, their canes long and untrimmed, swaying in the wind with a kind of unkempt beauty that seemed almost deliberate, as if the land itself had decided to be beautiful in the absence of anyone to maintain it. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the foundation and stood still for a long moment. The suitcase handle cold in her grip, the wind pushing her hair across her face. A voice came from the left past the collapsed section of fence that had once separated the Moseley property from the lot next door. I figured I'd never see another Moseley set foot on this ground. Hank Odom stepped into view from behind the overgrown privet hedge, a tall man made angular by age 82 years old, wearing a canvas jacket that had seen better decades, and a cap pulled low against the March wind. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints had opinions about sudden movements, but whose mind remained sharp and direct. Eleanor recognized him immediately, the way you recognize a landmark that has weathered but not moved. And he recognized her with the same instinct, the knowing that comes from decades of proximity and shared geography. Hank had been Iris's neighbor for the last 30 years of her life, a Korean War veteran and widower who maintained his small house 200 yards east with the stubborn independence of a man who had decided he would die in it and saw no reason to negotiate that point. He had known Iris, had watched her come and go from the outbuilding with the focused privacy of a woman who kept her own counsel, had attended her funeral and said little and meant all of it. He looked at Eleanor's suitcase, at her thin cardigan, at her face, and he understood the situation with the speed of someone who had lived long enough to recognize disaster without needing it explained. News traveled fast in rural Tennessee, and the story of Eleanor Brennan being put out of her house on Laurel Lane had made the rounds before the truck had even been loaded. He did not offer sympathy. Eleanor was grateful for that. Sympathy required responses she did not have energy to manufacture. Instead, Hank told her practical things. The outbuilding was still sound because Iris had built it with the best lumber available, had insisted on quality framing, and a proper foundation and roofing materials rated for decades rather than years. He had kept an eye on the property since the fire took the main house. Checked the roof after storms replaced a section of flashing 2 winters ago when he noticed it lifting. He could bring water from his well, had a spare camping lantern, extra blankets. And then he told her something that stopped her mid-step and made the key in her pocket feel suddenly physically warm. Your mother used to go up to that loft by herself, especially those last years. Carried things up there over multiple trips, careful as could be always when she thought nobody was watching. I asked her about it once. He paused, adjusting his cap against a gust that bent the wild roses sideways. She just looked at me with those iris eyes and said, "Insurance for the future, Hank. The kind no company can sell you." Eleanor thanked him, accepted the water and the lantern and the blankets and the quiet company of a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person in crisis is hand them something practical and get out of their way. She walked toward the outbuilding. It stood against the tree line at the rear of the property. 2 stories of wood and local stone, the lower level, a workshop and storage space, the upper level. The loft Iris had built herself in the late 1970s, with money saved over years of double shifts at the mill. Iris had called it her thinking room, the place she disappeared to on Sunday afternoons. The space that carried an atmosphere of deliberate privacy that even Eleanor as a child, and then as a young woman, had instinctively respected without ever being told to. The exterior had weathered to the soft gray of old silver. The small upper window was opaque with decades of dust and grime. The external staircase on the right side climbed at a steep angle, several middle steps visibly rotted through the handrail detached from its supports, and hanging at an angle that offered the illusion of assistance without any of the structural reality. And on the loft door, an iron padlock. Rusted completely, corrosion deep enough to measure in decades rather than years, the kind that speaks to a mechanism that has not been touched or tested or thought about since the day it was locked. No one had opened this door since Iris sealed it. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket with fingers stiffened by cold and age, and the tension of a moment that feels even as you live it, like it will divide your life into before and after. The key slid in, stiff, resistant, the internal mechanism corroded, nearly solid. She gripped it with both hands, applied steady, even pressure, lifted the body of the lock slightly to reduce the friction on the bolt. Her arthritic fingers screamed their objections in the specific language of inflamed joints forced to work beyond their comfort. She persisted. Nearly 2 minutes of sustained effort, her breath visible in the cold air, her jaw set with the expression she wore when she was threading a needle in bad light and refused to reach for her glasses. The lock released with a grinding click that echoed across the empty property like a small declaration. The door had swollen with moisture and years. She braced her shoulder against it and pushed, felt it resist and then yield with a reluctant groan of wood against wood, and stepped inside. The first breath tasted of cedar and age and the stillness of a room that has been holding its contents faithfully for 3 decades, waiting for the person it was sealed for to finally arrive. Smaller than she remembered, the ceiling sloped with the roofline standing height only at the center ridge. A small window let in thin March light, diffused through grime into something soft and gray and private. The floor was solid underfoot, good wood, the kind Iris had always insisted on for anything load-bearing, and that insistence had outlasted everything else. The space was not empty. Beneath the window, placed with unmistakable intention, sat a cedar chest, medium-sized brass fittings greened with patina, and beside it, draped over a wooden chair positioned there for exactly this purpose, was the memory quilt. Eleanor's breath stopped. Not figuratively, not as metaphor, but actually and physically ceased for a span of seconds that her body registered as a small emergency before resuming on its own. The memory quilt. Iris had spent 3 years making it hand-stitching fabric squares, cut from garments that mark the important moments in the family's life. A piece of Eleanor's childhood Easter dress, lavender cotton with white eyelet trim. A square from Walter's first good work shirt. Fragments from baby blankets and Sunday clothes and kitchen curtains and pieces Eleanor did not recognize, private selections from Iris's own history that she had never fully explained. The quilt was a textile autobiography, a family record kept in thread and pattern, and Eleanor had believed with absolute certainty that it had burned in the fire that took the main house 12 years ago. She had grieved it separately, that specific loss pulling from a different well than the grief for the house itself. Because the quilt was not a thing but a story, and losing it meant losing the only physical record of a narrative her mother had spent years telling in fabric. Iris had moved it here before the fire, had carried it up these stairs and placed it on this chair protected in cedar air preserved against moths and moisture and time. Whether she had known somehow that the house would burn or simply wanted to ensure this one object survived, regardless, the result was the same. The quilt was here. 30 years of darkness and silence, and it was here waiting patient as the woman who made it. Eleanor lowered herself onto the cedar chest because her knees would not support standing any longer, and she placed her hands on the quilt surface, and she felt the textures of a life she had thought was gone move beneath her fingertips, like a language she had forgotten she could read. When the quilt had given her everything it could offer through touch alone, Eleanor stood. The cedar chest waited beneath the spot where she had been sitting, and she lifted the lid with the deliberate slowness of a woman who understands that some containers, once opened, rearrange the entire room around them. The hinges had stiffened, but not seized. The scent that rose from inside was layered cedar and dried lavender sachets, whose fragrance had faded to a whisper. And beneath that, something she could only describe as her mother's hands, the smell of Iris's skin cream and wool, and the iron and thread atmosphere of a woman who sewed as naturally as she breathed. Beneath the sachets wrapped in protective cloth and tied with a faded blue ribbon that had once been the bright cobalt of a summer sky, 3 items lay arranged with the deliberate placement of a woman who had packed this chest knowing exactly who would open it and under what circumstances. A leather journal, its cover embossed with Iris's initials, and beneath them 4 words stamped in a typeface Eleanor recognized from the old label maker Iris kept in her sewing kit. For Eleanor, the truth. A large envelope sealed with candle wax, a sealing method from an era before self-adhesive strips, speaking to a person who wanted to ensure that what was inside remained undisturbed until the intended hands broke the seal. A set of documents folded with care, bearing the official stamp of the Sutter Falls municipal government, creased along lines that suggested they had been read multiple times before being folded for the last time and placed here. And separate from the others, tucked against the side of the chest, as if added as an afterthought or a final act of courage, a small envelope with Iris's handwriting across the front. Read this last. Eleanor's hands trembled before she touched any of it. She sat for a long while with the journal on her lap, the thin light shifting as clouds moved across the March sky outside the small window. And she let the trembling pass because she had learned decades ago that the body's first response to shock is unreliable, and you must wait for the second response, the steady one, before making any decisions. She opened the journal. The first page was written in Iris's careful hand, the penmanship of a woman who had left school at 16, but never stopped respecting the written word enough to form each letter with intention. My dear girl, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have finally come to the place I always kept for myself, and in the end for you. I wrote this journal over many weeks because there is too much truth for a single letter, and because I need you to understand everything fully, not just the facts, but the reasons and the failures and the love underneath all of it. I need you to know what happened in 1988. I need you to know what Russell Kemp did to you. And I need you to understand why I stayed silent when silence was the worst thing I could have chosen. Eleanor closed her eyes. Russell Kemp. The name landed against her sternum with physical weight, a blunt impact she felt in her teeth, in the roots of her hair, in the spaces between her ribs where breath should have been. 36 years since she had allowed that name to occupy the center of her thoughts. Rather than the periphery where she had trained herself to keep it behind walls she had built with the patient discipline of a woman who understood that some wounds examined directly become rooms you cannot leave. The journal told the story in Iris's voice, methodical and unflinching. The voice of a woman who had spent years assembling facts the way a mason assembles a wall, one verified stone at a time. In 1988, Eleanor was 42 years old and had spent the previous 4 years volunteering as coordinator for the Sutter Falls Community Development Fund, a locally organized effort that channeled donations and small grants toward infrastructure projects the town needed but could not fund through its anemic municipal budget. A new wing for the public library, equipment for the community health clinic, repairs to the senior center roof. Eleanor had organized fundraisers, managed donor relations, tracked allocations, and reported to the oversight board with the same meticulous attention she brought to every seam she sewed. She was good at it. People trusted her with their money because Eleanor Brennan was the kind of person who counted every penny twice and could account for where each one went. Russell Kemp was 43 years old in 1988. A county councilman with a wife and 4 children and a network of influence that extended through every significant institution in Sutter Falls and most of the surrounding county. He possessed the particular charisma that powerful men in small towns cultivate like a crop, warm in public settings, precise in private ones, fundamentally unaccustomed to hearing the word no from anyone he had decided should say yes. He controlled 3 of the 5 seats on the county oversight board through appointments and alliances. He approved business permits. He influenced zoning decisions. He sat on the boards of 2 local banks. In Sutter Falls, his word functioned as unofficial law, and most people found it easier and safer to treat it as such. Kemp decided he wanted Eleanor's cooperation in redirecting a portion of the development fund into a construction project that would benefit 2 of his political allies' men who owned the contracting company that would receive the work. He approached her privately, explained the arrangement with the relaxed confidence of a man who assumed that reasonable people understood how Sutter Falls actually operated beneath its civic surface. It was not a request, it was an orientation. A tour of the machinery, an invitation to step inside and become part of the mechanism. Eleanor refused, clearly, completely without ambiguity or room for reinterpretation. She told Kemp she would report the conversation to the oversight board if he raised the subject again. And she walked out of the meeting believing with the naivety of a person who has never been targeted by institutional power that the matter was closed. Within 3 weeks, Kemp appeared before the fund's oversight board with a carefully constructed accusation. Eleanor Brennan had approached him with a scheme to siphon fund money through fabricated invoices for sewing services never rendered. He presented documentation, invoices bearing Eleanor's name, business address, and service descriptions, documents he had manufactured himself with the resources available to a man who controlled the administrative offices of the county government. He performed the role of reluctant whistleblower. With practiced anguish, the good citizen forced by conscience to expose corruption, even when it pained him personally. Eleanor was removed from her position immediately. The investigation, conducted over 30 days by people operating within Kemp's sphere of influence, concluded that the allegations were credible. There was insufficient evidence for criminal prosecution, a fact Kemp had calibrated precisely. But the public finding was devastating enough to accomplish everything he needed. Eleanor lost her clients, was asked to withdraw from 2 other community organizations, became the subject of whispered conversations that followed her through grocery store aisles and church pews and school pickup lines for years, and then decades, the quiet, persistent hum of a reputation destroyed so thoroughly that even the people who liked her could not entirely separate the woman from the accusation. The journal continued. Iris wrote that she had watched her daughter absorb the destruction with the stoic composure of a woman who had been raised to endure, and it had broken Iris's heart in a way that the word heartbreak was not large enough to contain. Eleanor never spoke about it at length, never mounted a defense, never publicly accused Kemp of fabrication because she had no proof, and his word outweighed hers by the specific gravity of power and position and gender and the ancient mathematics of small-town hierarchies where certain people are believed and certain people are not. Eleanor turned the journal pages with fingers that had stopped trembling and started aching the deep ache of a body remembering a wound it had spent 36 years learning not to feel. The letters were next. She broke the wax seal on the large envelope and withdrew 2 sheets of paper, each covered in handwriting she did not recognize, each signed with a name she had never connected to her own story. Nadine Okafor's letter was dated September 1988, written on plain line paper in a hand that pressed hard enough to leave grooves on the reverse side, the penmanship of a woman writing under emotional pressure. Nadine had served as administrative secretary for the Sutter Falls municipal offices for 17 years. On the afternoon before Kemp filed his complaint with the oversight board, she had entered the document preparation room to retrieve supplies and found Kemp and his assistant working at the long table with blank invoice templates. A typewriter and several completed invoices bearing Eleanor Brennan's name and business information spread across the surface. Kemp covered the documents when he saw her, but not quickly enough. She recognized what she was seeing, immediately recognized it with the sick certainty of a person who has worked inside a system long enough to understand exactly what its corruption looks like when it stops hiding. Nadine did not come forward. Kemp controlled the direct supervisor she reported to. Her husband needed a county permit for his plumbing business that Kemp's office approved. She had 3 grandchildren whose school programs received funding. Kemp directed. The architecture of dependency was comprehensive, and Nadine understood with the practical clarity of a woman who had survived inside that architecture for nearly 2 decades that speaking publicly would destroy her and change nothing. She wrote to Iris instead because Iris was Eleanor's mother, and because writing it down and giving it to anyone was the minimum her conscience demanded. She signed the letter, a deeply ashamed witness. Leonard Pratt's letter carried a different weight. He was a local contractor, a man who moved in Kemp's professional circles, and 3 weeks before the oversight board meeting, he had been present at a private dinner where Kemp, relaxed among allies, spoke about Eleanor with the casual menace of a man discussing a pest control problem. Pratt heard Kemp describe Eleanor as becoming a problem that needs handling, and reference a way of dealing with people who don't understand how Sutter Falls works. The language was vague enough to deny and specific enough to understand the dialect of men who have wielded power long enough to discuss its deployment the way other people discuss weather. Pratt did not understand the full meaning until he sat in the oversight board meeting weeks later and watched Kemp dismantle Eleanor's reputation with fabricated documents and rehearsed outrage. Then he understood completely, and the understanding sat in his stomach like a stone he could not digest. He wrote to Iris because doing nothing at all was a weight his conscience refused to carry, even if what he did instead was inadequate and private, and addressed to an old woman rather than a judge. He signed his real name. Eleanor set the letters down on the quilt beside her and unfolded the documents. Official paper, the municipal stamp of Sutter Falls in the upper right corner, dated 1988. An unsigned authorization form for a construction contract specifying the project Kemp had intended to fund with redirected community money and naming the company that would receive the contract. The company's ownership records were attached, listing 2 men Eleanor recognized as Kemp's closest political allies. This was not testimony. This was not someone's word against someone else's. This was a physical document connecting Russell Kemp to a specific act of corruption with names, dates, project numbers, and the bureaucratic fingerprints of a scheme that had been planned in detail before Eleanor's refusal forced Kemp to choose between abandoning the plan and destroying the woman who threatened to expose it. Iris had gathered all of this, had collected letters from frightened witnesses and official documents from sources the journal did not identify, had assembled a case with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that truth without evidence is just another opinion, and evidence without safety is just another way to get hurt. The journal explained what happened next. After collecting the letters and documents over approximately 6 months, Iris had prepared to go public. Kemp learned of it through the same network of eyes and ears that allowed him to monitor every significant movement in Sutter Falls, and he visited Iris personally in 1989. He sat in her kitchen, accepted the coffee she offered, because she was raised to offer coffee to anyone who entered her home regardless of what they had done, and explained the situation with the pleasant directness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to make a threat felt. If Iris used the evidence publicly, Kemp would escalate his campaign against Eleanor. He would reframe the situation to suggest that Eleanor had recruited her elderly mother into a conspiracy of revenge. He would ensure Eleanor never received another sewing commission anywhere in the county. He would use his influence to affect the lives of Eleanor's children, who were then teenagers navigating schools and communities where Kemp's words shaped the social weather. Iris believed him. She had lived in Sutter Falls long enough to understand that Kemp's power was not theoretical, but operational, embedded in the daily mechanics of permits and appointments and recommendations, and the thousand small transactions that determine whether a person can function in a community or finds every door quietly, permanently closed. She made the calculation, and the calculation told her that public exposure would hurt Eleanor more than silence, that the evidence needed to be preserved, but not deployed, kept safe for a future moment when the cost of using it would be lower than the cost of holding it. She locked the loft, kept the key, and on her deathbed 5 years later, she passed it to Eleanor with words carefully chosen to be vague enough to protect and specific enough to remember, a message designed to activate only when its recipient had exhausted every other option and arrived at the precise emotional coordinates where fear no longer had jurisdiction. The journal addressed directly why Iris had not simply given the evidence to Eleanor. Iris knew her daughter's character, the way only a mother can, knew that Eleanor's courage was genuine but unstrategic, that she would fight the fire by walking into it rather than around it. If Eleanor had learned the truth in 1989, she would have gone directly at Kemp with the full force of her outrage, and Kemp would have crushed her completely rather than merely damaging her. So Iris had hidden the matches until the house had already burned. And Eleanor had nothing left to lose, because a woman with nothing to lose fights differently than a woman protecting what she has. She fights with the terrifying calm of someone who has already survived the worst and discovered on the other side of it that she is still standing. Eleanor read that passage and understood something she would not have been capable of understanding at 42 or 50 or 60. Her mother had been right. At 42, Eleanor would have launched herself at Kemp with fury and without armor, and he would have finished what he started. Now at 78, stripped of house and family and the last illusions of security, she possessed a clarity that rage had never offered her. She was calm to a degree that frightened her slightly, and that fear itself told her the calm was real. She opened the small envelope marked "Read this last." Inside was a single page different from the rest of the journal. No evidence, no names, no dates, just Iris writing to her daughter about her daughter. Iris wrote that she had always known Eleanor would find her way here, not because of the deathbed instructions, but because Eleanor was the kind of woman who, when pushed to the absolute edge, remembers every road she has not yet taken and chooses the one that leads toward truth rather than comfort. Iris wrote that her silence was the greatest failure of her life, that she would carry the guilt of it into whatever came after death. But she hoped Eleanor would see beneath the silence to the love that had chosen it, the particular and terrible love that accepts a lifetime of guilt in exchange for a daughter's survival. The last line, "Wear my navy dress, you know what to do." Eleanor folded the letter and held it against her chest, and the loft was quiet around her. in the way that only empty rooms in abandoned buildings are quiet. A silence so complete it becomes a presence, as if the space itself were listening. She placed the letter with the journal and the evidence and sat still on the cedar chest as the afternoon light moved across the floor in the slow migration of shadows that marks the passage of hours in rooms where no clock runs. She was not processing the information in the way that word is typically used, as if grief and revelation were files to be sorted and stored. She was letting it settle into her the way rain settles into dry ground, slowly through every available opening, reaching depths that had been parched so long they had forgotten what moisture felt like. Night came to the loft in increments. The window darkened from gray to charcoal to the deep blue that precedes true dark. Eleanor did not light Hank's lantern immediately. She sat in the gathering darkness with the quilt pulled around her shoulders and the evidence in her lap. And she thought with the precise methodical focus she had always brought to the most complex sewing jobs, the ones where a single misplaced stitch could ruin the entire garment. Tomorrow was the Sutter Falls Spring Community Festival, the largest public gathering of the year. Every significant figure in town would attend. The mayor, the city council members, the heads of every civic organization, the people who had believed Kemp's accusation 36 years ago, and the people who had simply absorbed it as background fact, part of the town's settled history, unquestioned. Because questioning it would require effort, and effort requires caring. And caring about Eleanor Brennan had never been anyone's priority. Russell Kemp would be there. 79 years old, now retired from official office, but still treated as an institution, still occupying the center of every room he entered, still radiating the manufactured warmth that had been his most effective tool for half a century. People would shake his hand and laugh at his jokes and treat him with the deference owed to a man who had shaped their community, never knowing or never caring that part of what he had shaped was a lie that had buried a woman alive for 36 years. Eleanor understood something about what needed to happen next, with a clarity that surprised her, with its absence of rage. Evidence presented poorly by a person who appeared desperate or unstable would be dismissed as easily as if it did not exist. Kemp had spent decades building credibility. She had spent decades having hers dismantled. If she walked into that festival looking like what her children had made her, a homeless old woman with nothing left, clutching papers and demanding to be heard, she would confirm every dismissive assumption the town had ever made about her, and the evidence would die on the floor of the civic center between coffee cups and folding chairs. She needed to arrive as something else entirely, not a supplicant, not a victim seeking redress, a woman delivering truth with the authority of someone who has carried it long enough to know its exact weight and no longer intends to carry it alone. Begging invites pity, and pity invites dismissal. She had not walked 4 miles on aching knees and climbed rotting stairs and opened a 30-year-old lock to be pitied. She lifted the last item from the chest. Beneath the letters and the journal, folded in cedar-scented cloth, lay a dress. Navy wool, deep and dark as ink, cut with the clean authority of a woman who understood that clothes communicate before the mouth opens. Silver buttons, a collar that sat with quiet command. Iris's church dress, the one she wore to every occasion that mattered, funerals and town halls. And the morning she decided the world would take her seriously. Preserved in cedar and lavender. Iris had been nearly Eleanor's size, a coincidence that felt in this room and at this hour like anything but coincidence. Eleanor lit the lantern. Its glow turned the loft into a small warm chamber, the cedar chest casting a long shadow, the quilt glowing with the colors of a life she had thought was ashes. She examined the dress with the professional eye of a woman who had spent 50 years understanding how fabric works, how it falls where it gives what it promises the body wearing it. The waist needed taking in. The hem needed dropping an inch. 2 buttons had tarnished beyond recovery. She reached into the chest one more time and found at the very bottom a small cloth roll containing a needle-cased thread in 3 colors and a handful of loose buttons in varying sizes and finishes, 2 of which matched the dress's remaining buttons closely enough to pass. Iris had packed a sewing kit, had placed it beneath everything else at the bottom of the chest, as if she knew that the last thing her daughter would need before walking out of this room was the means to alter the armor. Eleanor worked through the night. The needle was familiar in her hands, the way breath is familiar in lungs, an act so deeply encoded in her body that fatigue and cold and the ache in her knuckles could slow it but not stop it. She opened the waist seams, removed the excess, resewed with stitches tight and even and invisible. She dropped the hem, pressing the new fold with the flat of her palm, heated against the lantern glass because she had no iron, and improvisation was the native language of every seamstress who had ever worked with limited tools. She replaced the two dead buttons with the brighter ones from the kit, matching them by touch, as much as sight in the uneven lantern light. By the time dawn light began to filter through the small window, mixing with the lantern's amber glow, to create a palette of pale gold and gray, she had transformed the dress from a garment preserved in a chest into something that looked entirely intentional. A woman wearing this dress would not look like someone who had slept in a loft and sewn by lamplight. She would look like someone who had prepared carefully because she had something important to say and fully intended to be heard. Eleanor put the dress on, adjusted the collar, smoothed the wool across her hips where her alterations had restored the silhouette Iris would have recognized. She found a small hand mirror at the bottom of the chair, where the quilt had rested half hidden beneath the seat. She held it up in the early light and studied the face that looked back at her. And for the first time in months, she recognized the woman in the reflection. Not the woman her children had reduced to a logistics problem. Not the woman Sutter Falls had convicted without trial 36 years ago. The woman Iris had raised and Walter had loved, and time had tested, and none of it, none of the accumulated weight of loss and betrayal and silence had managed to break. She looked ready. She looked like her mother's daughter. At 7:15 that morning, Clara Jessup's phone rang at her apartment downtown. Hank Odom's number, which she had saved after interviewing him for background on the Laurel Lane piece. His voice carried the gravel of early morning and a current of something she could not immediately identify, but would later recognize as anticipation. That woman you wrote about last week, Eleanor Brennan, she's been at the Mosley property overnight. She found something in that loft her mother locked up 30 years ago, and she's getting dressed like she's going to war. If you're the kind of reporter who wants to be in the room when the room changes, I'd suggest you get to the Civic Center by 9:30. He hung up before Clara could ask a single question. She was in her car in 4 minutes. Eleanor placed the journal, the letters, and the authorization documents into the interior pocket of the dress where they rested against her ribs, like a second heartbeat. She folded the quilt carefully and laid it on the chest. She turned off the lantern. She opened the loft door to a morning that smelled of damp earth and early spring, and the stillness that gathers before events the world will not be able to undo. She descended the stairs, testing each step, and began walking toward town. The Sutter Falls Civic Center occupied a block of Main Street, with the stolid brick confidence of a building erected in 1952 by people who believed their town would grow into something larger than it ever did. At 9:45 on the morning of March 5th, the parking lot was filling with pickups and sedans and the occasional minivan discharging families who treated the Spring Community Festival as both civic obligation and social calendar. The one day each year when everyone who mattered and everyone who wished they mattered gathered under fluorescent lights to congratulate themselves on belonging to a place small enough to know your name and powerful enough to decide what that name was worth. Eleanor crossed the lot without pausing. The navy dress moved with her in the way good wool moves, absorbing motion rather than fighting it, the altered waist, sitting exactly where it should. The collar framing her face with the quiet authority Iris had always carried into rooms that were not expecting her. The documents rested against her ribs inside the dress's interior pocket, their edges pressing into her skin with each breath, a physical reminder of what she carried and what it meant, and what it would cost to release it into a room full of people who had spent 36 years preferring the version of events that required nothing of them. People noticed her at the entrance. Some recognized her face and placed it in the context of old gossip, the seamstress from the fund scandal. Wasn't that her name, Brennan something Brennan? Others did not recognize her at all, but responded to the quality of focused intention in the way she moved through the foyer. A directional certainty that made people step aside on instinct, the way pedestrians yield to someone walking as though the sidewalk belongs to them. Inside the main hall, folding tables lined with coffee urns and pastry trays formed a perimeter around a central open area where clusters of townspeople stood in the loose configurations of people who see each other often enough to skip introductions. The mayor occupied a corner near the stage. Two city council members stood by the beverage table debating something with the performative intensity of men who enjoy the sound of their own disagreement. A banner reading Sutter Falls, Spring Festival Building Community Together hung above the stage with an irony available only to those who know what the word community has actually cost. Clara Jessup stood near the far wall with a coffee cup she was not drinking, scanning the room with the restless attention of a reporter whose instincts were signaling something she could not yet name. She had arrived at 9:20, Hank's call still vibrating in her chest, and she had positioned herself with a clear sightline to the main entrance. When Eleanor walked in, Clara recognized her immediately, the same woman from the Laurel Lane sidewalk, but transformed so completely that the transformation itself became the first sentence of a story Clara was already writing in her head. She pulled out her phone and began recording. Eleanor found Russell Kemp, where she knew he would be, at the gravitational center of the largest group in the hall, surrounded by people who stood close and laughed on cue, and treated him with the deference accorded to monuments rather than men. He was 79. The years had reduced him physically, taken height and breadth, but they had not diminished the practiced warmth he wore like a second skin, the tool that had opened every door and closed every mouth he needed, closed for more than half a century. His hair was white, his suit was pressed, his handshake still carried the measured firmness of a man who had calibrated every physical gesture for maximum effect. Eleanor walked straight toward him. The crowd between them thinned and parted with the unconscious choreography of people responding to a force they did not understand, but could feel the way a room reconfigures itself around a person moving with absolute purpose. Conversations dimmed in her wake like candles in a draught. Kemp looked up when she was 10 feet away. The recognition was instantaneous, arriving in his face before his conscious mind could intercept and manage it. And what it did to his complexion was immediate and total. The blood drained from his skin so completely and so rapidly that the woman standing beside him, his wife of 53 years, reached for his arm with the reflexive concern of someone who believes they are witnessing a medical event. His mouth opened, nothing came out. His eyes locked on Eleanor's face and then dropped to the documents visible in her hand, the edges of paper extending from her grip, like evidence at a trial that had been adjourned for 36 years and was now without warning back in session. Eleanor stopped 3 feet from him. The hall had gone quiet in expanding circles, silence spreading outward from the two of them like ripples in water. Conversations dying mid-sentence as people turned to watch something they could not identify but could not ignore. Her voice carried across the space with the clarity of a bell struck once in a still room. "Councilman Kemp, my name is Eleanor Brennan. I believe you remember me. I have something that has waited 36 years to be returned to you." She withdrew the letters from the interior pocket, held them up with a hand that did not waver, and let the room see them. Paper. Ordinary paper. But the way she held it and the way Kemp looked at it communicated to every person watching that this paper was anything but ordinary. 36 years ago, you told this community that I attempted to steal from the Public Development Fund. You presented fabricated invoices as evidence. You destroyed my reputation, my livelihood, and my standing in this town to protect yourself from a woman who refused to help you steal first. The silence in the civic center had texture of physical density, as if the air itself had solidified around the words and was holding them in place for examination. No one moved, no one reached for a phone, no one coughed or shifted or looked away. The room had become a single organism with a single point of focus, and that focus was a 78-year-old woman in her dead mother's dress holding paper that smelled like cedar and 30 years of darkness. I have letters from 2 witnesses who saw you fabricate those documents with their own eyes. I have signed testimony describing your stated intention to destroy me weeks before you carried it out. And I have the original 1988 authorization form showing exactly which construction project you intended to funnel public funds into and the names of the men who owned the company that would have received the money. She paused, not for dramatic effect, for precision, because what she said next mattered more than anything she had said in 36 years, and she intended to say it exactly right. I'm not asking this community to take my word against yours. I am presenting documented evidence from multiple sources who were silenced by their fear of your power. I am asking you now in front of every person in this room, did you fabricate the evidence against me, yes or no? The silence that followed her question lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Kemp's wife withdrew her hand from his arm slowly, the gesture of a woman who has suddenly realized that the man beside her is not having a medical episode, but a reckoning. Across the hall near the beverage table, a man Eleanor did not recognize but whose face appeared on the 1988 authorization documents began moving toward the exit with the careful nonchalance of someone trying very hard not to be noticed leaving. Clara Jessup's phone was recording. 3 other phones had joined it. Kemp's mouth worked again, producing nothing. His eyes swept the room, searching the faces around him for the familiar warmth, the habitual deference, and finding instead something new and terrible, the dawning comprehension of people who are rearranging 36 years of assumptions in real time. He looked at the letters in Eleanor's hand. He looked at the authorization form. He looked at Eleanor's face, at the absolute absence of desperation in her expression, and whatever architecture of denial he had maintained inside himself for 3.5 decades collapsed with the silent finality of a structure whose supports have been removed. Yes. The word was barely audible, a sound produced by lungs that seemed to have forgotten their capacity. Then louder with the fractured quality of a man releasing a weight he did not know he could no longer carry. Yes, I fabricated the complaint. I fabricated the invoices. She refused to help me redirect the fund money, and I was afraid she would report me, so I destroyed her credibility before she could destroy mine. Everything I accused her of, I was the one who did it. The Civic Center erupted, not with a single sound, but with the overlapping collision of gasps and exclamations, and the sudden kinetic energy of 100 people all moving at once, turning to each other, reaching for phones, standing up, sitting down, the chaotic release of a room that has just absorbed a detonation and does not yet know what shape the aftermath will take. Clara Jessup had captured everything: the approach, the documents, the accusation, the confession, the crowd's reaction. She posted the video within the hour with a caption that contained no editorializing. Because the footage needed none, 78-year-old woman confronts the man who framed her 36 years ago. He confesses. Watch to the end. By Sunday evening, 200,000 people had watched it. By Monday morning, the number had crossed 1 million. The video did what videos do in the age of algorithmic distribution. It found the audiences most likely to feel something about it and delivered itself to them with the efficiency of a system designed to maximize engagement. And what it engaged was a deep and universal hunger for justice that arrives late but arrives whole, carried by someone who earned it through endurance rather than power. But Sutter Falls did not experience the video as a unified community rallying behind a wronged woman. The town split along fault lines that had existed long before Eleanor walked into the civic center, and the earthquake she triggered merely made them visible. There were defenders, Kemp's allies, the people who had built relationships and businesses and social positions within the ecosystem he had cultivated for decades. pushed back with the instinctive solidarity of organisms whose habitat is threatened. The confession was coerced by public pressure. An old man ambushed at a community event cannot be held to what he says under duress. 36 years have passed, and the responsible thing is to let old wounds heal rather than ripping them open for the satisfaction of one woman's grudge. A columnist at the Sutter Falls Gazette, one of the old guard who had covered Kemp favorably for years, published an editorial that Wednesday under the headline, "Justice or Vengeance When the Past Should Stay Past." The piece questioned whether pursuing accountability after nearly 4 decades served the community or merely served Eleanor Brennan's personal resentment, and it was written with the sanctimony available only to people who have never been on the receiving end of the injustice they are advising others to forgive. Eleanor read the editorial at the kitchen table Hank O'Dom had carried from his own house to the loft, so she would have a surface to eat on. She read it entirely, folded the newspaper along its original creases and set it aside. She did not write a response. She did not call the editor. She had not demanded that everyone agree with her. She had demanded that the truth be spoken aloud. Those were different things, and Eleanor was old enough to understand the difference without anyone explaining it. Someone left a note on the loft door overnight, block letters on lined paper. The handwriting of a person who did not want their penmanship recognized. "Go home, old woman." Eleanor removed it, folded it, placed it in the cedar chest with the other documents. Evidence of a different kind. Clara Jessup did not write an editorial. She wrote journalism. Over the following week, she drove 40 miles to a managed care facility where Nadine Okafor, now 96 years old, lived in a room with a window facing east. Nadine confirmed her letter was authentic. She described the afternoon in the document preparation room in detail that had not faded, despite the decades, the way certain memories sharpen rather than blur, because the shame attached to them refuses to let them soften. Clara recorded the conversation with Nadine's permission. Nadine cried, and when she stopped crying, she said she had carried the weight of her silence like a stone in her chest for 36 years, and she was grateful at 96 to finally set it down. Clara found 2 additional sources who corroborated Leonard Pratt's account of the private dinner where Kemp had discussed handling Eleanor. She published a 3-part investigative series in the county paper, transforming the story from a viral video moment into a documented case with multiple confirmed sources, official records, and a pattern of corruption that extended beyond a single incident into the structural fabric of Sutter Falls governance throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. Russell Kemp resigned from every public and charitable position he held within 48 hours of the video's publication. The County Commissioner's Office announced a formal review of historical community fund allocations dating back to the 1980s. Kemp's 2 former political allies, the men whose names appeared on the 1988 authorization form, retained lawyers before the week was out. One of them left Sutter Falls entirely within 10 days, relocating to a daughter's home in another state, with the haste of a man who understands that the ground beneath him has become unreliable. On Wednesday, 4 days after the confrontation, all 3 of Eleanor's children arrived at the Briarwood Road property simultaneously. They stood at the bottom of the loft staircase and looked up at their mother in the doorway, and their faces carried the expression of people who have been forced by external events to see something they had successfully avoided seeing for years, the recognition of failure, arriving not as a sudden blow, but as a slow tide that has been rising unnoticed and has now reached the level where breathing requires effort. Martin spoke first. His voice had lost the efficient corporate cadence that had characterized every interaction Eleanor could remember in recent years, replaced by something rawer and less practiced. The sound of a man speaking from a place he does not visit often because it requires honesty he is not accustomed to providing. "We didn't know about Kemp, didn't know any of it, but Mom, we should have believed you anyway. Should have believed you because you're our mother, not because a viral video proved you right." Eleanor looked at her 3 children from the loft doorway for a long time before she spoke. The March wind moved through the trees behind the outbuilding, and pressed against the navy wool of the dress she was still wearing, because she had not yet found a reason to take it off. You had 36 years of chances to ask me honestly about what happened, instead of quietly absorbing the town's version and making it your own. You had a month before I needed help, and none of you found anything inside yourselves to give. I saved myself. I found your grandmother's evidence and cleared my own name while you watched from the crowd. I need you to understand the full weight of that before anything else gets said. Judith was crying, not the contained, managed tears of a woman who controls her emotional presentation, but the unguarded weeping of someone whose defenses have been stripped away by the simple act of hearing the truth, stated plainly by the person they failed. Dean, who had been the quietest presence on the morning of the eviction, who had leaned against his car and smiled while his mother's life was loaded onto a donation truck, now spoke with the halting precision of a man choosing each word as if it were the last one he would be allowed. I was the one who laughed, Mom, on the sidewalk that morning. When you said you were going to Briarwood Road, I laughed. I will never be able to unhear that sound coming out of my own mouth. I am sorry. The specificity of it landed harder than any general apology could have. Not I'm sorry for everything, not we should have done better. But the exact moment identified and owned the precise sound of his own cruelty played back to him by his own memory until it became unbearable. Martin nodded slowly, absorbing the full measure of his mother's words, without attempting to redistribute their weight onto extenuating circumstances or good intentions, or the comfortable fiction that they had done their best when their best had been nothing at all. Eleanor led them in, not because the damage had healed. It had not, it would not for a long time, perhaps not completely ever, but because Iris had preserved the truth across 3 decades fueled by love rather than hatred. And Eleanor intended to honor that example in the way she lived whatever years remained to her. Vengeance was easy. Choosing to leave the door open after people you love have walked through it carelessly, that required something harder than courage. It required the willingness to be disappointed again. Margaret Fenn contacted Eleanor the following week. She was a 45-year-old attorney practicing in Sutter Falls, a transplant from Nashville, who had moved to the area for the lower overhead and stayed for the community she believed in. And Clara Jessup's investigative series had provided her with exactly the documented case she could build a civil action around. She offered to take Eleanor's case pro bono. The process was not simple. Kemp's legal team responded with the predictable strategy of contesting the confession's validity, arguing that a statement made under the pressure of a public confrontation did not constitute a reliable legal admission. The argument had technical merit and emotional bankruptcy in roughly equal measure, and it might have succeeded in a courtroom where only the confession existed as evidence. But the evidence extended far beyond the confession now. Iris's original documents, Nadine Okafor's confirmed testimony recorded and notarized, Leonard Pratt's letter corroborated by 2 additional witnesses Clara had located, the 1988 authorization form with its names and project numbers, and the bureaucratic DNA of a corruption scheme preserved in municipal ink. The cumulative weight of documentation made a public trial a worse option for Kemp than a private resolution, and his attorneys, who understood the mathematics of damage control, even if their client did not negotiate a settlement. The settlement was large enough to change the material conditions of Eleanor's life. She purchased a small house on the eastern edge of Sutter Falls, a 1-story with a south-facing spare room she converted immediately into a sewing workshop. The light in that room was good warm in the morning and steady through the afternoon, the kind of light that makes fabric colors true and needlework precise. And Eleanor recognized it the moment she walked through the door during the showing, as the room she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. She hung the memory quilt on the workshop wall, positioned where she could see it from her sewing table, the colors of her family's history visible at the edge of her vision while she worked. Below it, she mounted a shadow box containing the 3 letters Iris's journal entry, about the evidence, and a small typed card, Truth Preserved by Love, Iris Moselli, 1988. 2 months after she moved in, Eleanor answered a knock at her front door on a Tuesday afternoon and found Hank O'Dom standing on the porch, holding a small cardboard box. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he always wore, and his face carried the expression of a man who has been holding something for a long time and is finally able to hand it to the person it belongs to. He explained that on the morning of the eviction, he had been driving past Laurel Lane on his way to the hardware store. He saw the donation truck being loaded and recognized from a distance the scene for what it was. He pulled over. As the truck pulled away from the curb, a small box fell from the tailgate and landed on the pavement. Hank picked it up, intending to return it, but the truck was already turning the corner, and the house was empty, and he did not know where Eleanor had gone. He kept the box at his house for months, unable to locate her, until her face appeared on television screens across the county, and he suddenly knew exactly where to find her. Inside the box was the Valentine's card. Walter's handwriting on the inside, the careful blocky letters of a man who wrote slowly because he wanted every word to matter, preserved in the small wooden case Eleanor had kept it in for 11 years before it disappeared into the truck with everything else. Eleanor held the card against her chest and stood in the doorway of her new house and felt the afternoon sun on her face and did not cry, not because crying was weakness, but because what she felt had moved past the territory where tears were adequate into a quieter country, where gratitude and grief occupied the same space and neither needed expression to be real. Hank tipped his cap and walked back to his truck and drove away without requiring thanks, because he was the kind of man who understood that some acts of decency are diminished by acknowledgement and amplified by silence. 7 months passed. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Eleanor was in her garden. Her hands in the soil, she had spent the summer amending with compost and patience the roses she had transplanted from the Briarwood property, finally establishing roots in their new bed. The air carried the warmth of early Tennessee autumn, the season that arrives like an apology for summer's excess, and the light had the golden quality that photographers covet and gardeners understand instinctively as the signal that the year is turning toward rest. Judith appeared at the garden gate without announcement. She carried 2 cups of coffee from the shop on Main Street, and her face wore no agenda, no clipboard, no calculated expression of concern or obligation. Just her face, open and uncertain, the face of a 51-year-old woman standing at her mother's garden gate, hoping to be let in, and not at all sure she had earned the right. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and took the coffee, and they sat on the small front porch. 2 chairs Eleanor had bought at the same flea market in Grover's Mill, where Walter had found her sewing basket 40 years ago, and they talked for 2 hours. About Walter, about Iris, about the things that had never been said because the family had built its silences so carefully and maintained them so long that breaking them felt like demolition rather than conversation. Judith asked about the memory quilt, asked Eleanor to explain the squares, each one what they meant, whose life they came from, what Iris was trying to preserve in thread and fabric. And Eleanor told her about the lavender eyelet Easter dress and Walter's work shirt, and the pieces she did not recognize, the private selections from Iris's own history that would remain mysteries now. Stories sealed inside the quilt itself, legible only to the woman who sewed them and the cloth that held them. And as she told the stories, Eleanor realized she was doing exactly what Iris had always intended, transmitting the family's history through voice and presence and the gift of time spent together. The oldest and most reliable form of preservation. Older than journals, older than photographs, older than evidence locked in cedar chests. The simple act of one generation sitting with the next and saying, "This is where we came from, this is what it cost, this is what survived." The October light moved across the porch in the slow, unhurried way that late afternoon light moves when there is nowhere it needs to be. And Eleanor felt something settle inside her that she recognized gradually, and with deep gratitude as the silence that follows a very long storm. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace, the quality of quiet that arrives only after everything loud has finished and the air has cleared. And the ground, though changed, is solid again beneath your feet. She had lost 36 years to a lie. She had found her way back through the truth her mother loved her enough to keep. And at 78, with good soil in the garden, and real light in the sewing room, and her daughter's hand resting near hers on the arm of a flea market chair, Eleanor Brennan had finally, completely, irreversibly come home.